Hi, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I'm going to be building out my bay window area, adding bench seating, planters, and of course as many lights as I can cram in. I changed the design several times and tried a lot of new things here, so keep watching to check out the process. This is the next space that I'm going to try and tackle. It's about 8 feet or so. Let me make sure. It's more like 10 feet. My initial thought was to have a bench along the back side, but 10 feet for sure is going to be way too much, way too wide. So I think houseplants would do pretty well in this space. And since we have all this extra room in here, we could make planters on either side and then just a bench across the back. Another thing I'm thinking stylistically, so I could have it a triangle like this or almost like a circle. Here I can make an opening for this planter box and have the bench rest inside there. Probably LEDs, because why not? Alright, let's get it going. We begin this adventure by building a basic frame for the bench portion, and I'm using this staple of American building, and that is 2x4s. Nothing fancy here, not doing any milling, just cutting down the lengths on the miter saw and assembling with screws. I also made a couple vertical support frames, and this was one of those rare cases where I actually got to use my framing nailer. I bought this a few years back and I've used it exactly 3 times, including this time, so money well spent. This framing went fairly quickly, and naively, I started to think that I was making a lot of progress, which is never how these things go. Little did I know that I had barely left the trailhead on this trek, and it was going to be a long and arduous journey. After getting these screws in the wall, it lifted this thing up, and now we're off the ground. Got embedded shims for this very reason. I absolutely love doing built-ins, and I think it really changes the look of a room and adds a lot of function, but one thing that always makes it a challenge is uneven walls. As houses settle over time, the walls tend to shift away from a once square and accurately assembled structure to a goofy carnival house of mirrors that mocks anybody thinking that they stayed square. The trick, though, is to set your expectations appropriately and plan ahead with shims, trim, and other things to compensate. I've made benches before with just plywood, and they're pretty uncomfortable to sit on for more than a few seconds. One thing you could do is just put a cushion on here, buy a cushion for this, which is perfectly fine. But I don't want to mess with any kind of finishing or anything on this, so I want to make it the whole thing just covered with some kind of upholstery or fabric. With the bench frame in place, I got to work on the planters, and these proved to be a massive undertaking after all was said and done, albeit one of the most fun things I've built in a long time. Like the bench, I started with an underlying frame, and I mentioned in the intro that these were going to be round planters, so the first thing I got to work on was cutting out a template for the round shape. I made this template by first tracing an arc on a piece of cardboard, using a nail and some string and a pencil, basically like making a large compass and keeping the string taut while I scribed the arc. Once I was happy with the cardboard template, I transferred that onto my main template, which is going to be made out of 1/2" MDF. I only needed to be precise with the one main template because I was going to proceed to cut several more of these in roughly the same shape and then use a flush trim bit to shape the rest and match my original template. I took this opportunity to challenge myself and use as many crappy materials that I could salvage in my shop while still making sure that they would be structurally effective. I think I broke the record here using 5 different materials, including MDF, Baltic birch plywood, CDX plywood, oriented strand board, and finally particle board for one of them. You may be wondering why I have all this junk taking up valuable space in the shop, but I mean, I knew their day would come, so who's laughing now? I've just been playing around with some of the layouts of these boards. I think I'm going to cut out some more arcs that'll rise them off the ground, and then this bottom arc will be just like a black lip basically on the bottom. And since I'm doing one on the bottom, I might as well do one on the top so we have some symmetry, just to give it that kind of floating separation look. I made the arcs for the top and bottom slightly oversized from the others so that they'll have a distinction, and then painted the fronts black. After seeing how the black looked though, I felt like that gave the planters a cheap DIY feel, so I changed up the plan and decided to add a walnut edge banding on these. And now I'm going to take a moment to gush about my pin nailer. I mentioned it before, but I freaking love this thing. Their main superpower is how small the nails are so they don't create large holes in the material. And for small trim pieces, nothing works better. You still need glue in most cases, but these hold things together quite well while the glue dries. And I consider this to be one of the 3 tools in the holy trinity of fastener tools, with the other 2 being the brad nailer and of course the stapler. With all of the arcs cut out, I started to assemble these planter frames, starting with nailing one of the arcs down to the beautifully edge-banded bottom lip pieces. I then ripped down some 2x4s in half to create 2x2s, and these would be the vertical supports holding together all of the arcs. I used 2x2s instead of 2x4s, mainly just to save material, and these would be plenty strong. They also have a smaller footprint, so they were just generally easier to work with and allowed for more openness in the frame to work around. Either that, or I'm just that cheap, and these are the stories I'm telling myself. I continued to work my way up the levels while staggering the vertical supports so I could have room to drive in the screws. You may be wondering why there are all these different levels, and that will make more sense as things start to come together. Just a quick explanation on the structure. I have 6 of these curved boards. The top and bottom ones are really just decorative more than anything. But for the most part, these rings are just here to provide a backing structure for the boards I'm going to attach. I'm leaving this empty cavity in the middle section for the bench that's going to slide in here. I'm going to have boards coming across the top and across the bottom, so I need 2 points of contact for those 2 sections. Alright, that's one down. One more to go. Good. It must be a chair. Ah. Add these.
Wow. It looks even better than I thought.
My lumber rack is gloriously stocked right now with about 100 board feet of this white oak, which looks like this. It's very warm, light wood, and really pretty grain patterns. It is quite expensive. I think I paid about $9 a board foot or so, which is the discounted price for getting a minimum of 100 board feet from my supplier. They do a lot of the prep work already for me, so they surface both sides, and then I have one straight edge to reference to rip down the width that I need. So I don't have a ton of work to do in terms of milling these. I also got a couple boards of this walnut, which is even more expensive. It's about $10.50 a board foot. I wasn't just bragging about my lumber on hand there. I do intend to use both the white oak and the walnut for this project. Generally, my goal as far as aesthetics was to clad as much of this bench with white oak that I could, and then use walnut as the accents. And in my opinion, white oak and walnut, as far as contrasting woods, work really beautifully together. I only wish they were cheaper, but sometimes in life, if you want something to be nice, you gotta pay for the real thing, and for this one, I wanted to go all out. And I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty smitten with this white oak, if you know what I mean. I planned on cladding the planters with white oak, and after ripping and cutting them down to size, I got to work on the transition boards that would come in contact with the bench. So I did some real woodworking here to cut out a beveled notch so the boards sitting on the round planter would sit flush against the front part of the bench. Oh yes. I'm going to use this board for the cladding of the bottom part of the front of the bench. So I'm going to resaw this in half, that way it can get double coverage. I'm going to add some 1/2-inch walnuts. So it's going to look like this. So I'm going to glue them up first and then I'll resaw them later.
Oh, if you couldn't tell, it's 7 a.m. So that's why my voice sounds a little raspy. I'm not sick, I just woke up. And it's Saturday.
But the grind don't stop, you know? Okay, the big moment has come and it's time to get this white oak cladding on the planter frames. I'm taping them up and attaching them all in one shot like this for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to face nail these boards because of the holes, and two, I want to keep all the boards nice and uniform both vertically and horizontally, and the tape will help to keep them together. I hope. Oh god, there it goes. Oh, tape's coming apart. And now I want to thank one of my viewers on one of my other videos who recommended strap clamps. They were recommended for gluing up picture frames, but for some reason the concept of strap clamps had stayed completely off my radar over the years. But for this kind of glue up, they were incredibly clutch, so thank you again, Barry Halstead 9299. You're the man. I don't have boards here because that's going to be under the bench, so I don't want to waste any hardwood I don't have to waste. And speaking of my viewers, I love feedback, positive and negative, so please, if you see anything you like or don't like, or have any advice for me and the other viewers, leave a comment. I read and respond to all my comments, so if you want to get some interaction with the genius behind vanishing cabinets, that's the quickest way. Alright. Since I didn't bevel the edges of the white oak boards, there were going to be gaps between them as they made the curve around the arc. And truthfully, I didn't think the gaps looked that bad left untouched, but ultimately I decided to fill them, and this is where the walnut is going to shine. I ripped down some angled strips at 20 degrees, which was roughly the angle of the gaps, but they didn't have to fit imperfect, just enough to fill and cover the facade of the planters. I added a generous amount of glue and again utilized the strap clamps to hold the strips in place while the glue dried. Quick tip here, try and scrape off the excess glue about an hour after applying. It's a lot more pliable and easier to remove prior to it fully drying. So now I gotta get these little walnut strips cut down and flush to these boards here. I think the best tool for this is gonna be my electric hand plane. I'm gonna try and take off like 80% of the material with that, and then sand the rest down with the palm sander or random orbit sander. That's my best idea right now. We'll see how it goes. Bosch drawer. Yep. Truthfully, I had no idea if this was gonna work, but I was pretty conservative when cutting out these walnut strips, so there was a lot of material to remove to get the strips flush. I may look confident using this tool, but in reality, I was terrified. I kept thinking the planer was going to slip off or something and just make a huge gash in the side of the planters. But I just made sure to make really shallow passes, and after enough reps, I got pretty comfortable using this and almost cocky at times. That worked really well. That was about 5 minutes, and I got through like half of one of them. So maybe just like 15 minutes total to get through the whole thing. This tool, you know, it comes in handy every now and again. Although the electric hand plane did make quick work of most of the material, there was still a lot of cleanup work to be done. So I proceeded to give these planters the total care package, complete with a manicure, pedicure, and a deep tissue massage. It's not often I break out the block plane, but after giving the blade a fresh sharpening, this thing was cutting through the grain like butter. And this sure beats the hell out of sanding. This is like the main hazard though of using that hand plane. Got a little carried away. So now I have to sand this whole thing down to get it even to where this line is. You live and you die by that kind of stuff though. So now I'm glad I have full 3/4 inch on here, so I actually am able to do that. Since I'm too cheap to buy matching wood filler, I'm just making my own with some sawdust from my respective materials and glue. It's just like making pancakes. Just keep adding mix until the consistency is right. Dinner is served. This does a decent job filling cracks, but it doesn't look perfect with finish, so always try and reduce these where possible. Alright, yeah, I know that's very obvious advice. A couple of days ago I had just the frame of these round planters staged in place, and a friend came by and saw them and made the comment, are those going to be shelves in there? And obviously I don't want to do this because of the extra work it's going to add, but I don't know, I think it might look better with shelves in there. And it'll have more utility to it, so I need to think how I'm going to do that. So I think I'm going to make shelves more on the skinny side. That way I can give as much of this surface area that I can, that I've worked so hard to clean up and get looking like this. I think I can use a track saw somehow if I get the right setup going. Look at this genius contraption of leverage and ingenuity. This has to be one of the most awkward, unwieldy workpieces I've ever made, and now that I want to make some straight lines right into the face of this curve, I had to get creative with the setup. After tracing out where I wanted the shelf openings, I ended up propping the planter on some buckets to get the angle of the shelves as level as possible. Then I clamped my track to a sawhorse, and finally just said a quick prayer. Went a little bit far on that one. I think I just have to recut this line because this length was arbitrary anyway. I don't really have a good way to repair that. Getting another 1/2 inch out of this shelf. Okay, got the next line cut over to match this mistake. I considered these cuts to be some of the most risky cuts I did in the entire project, given how badly it could go and all the work I had already put in. But the track saw is such a smooth tool that I wouldn't trust myself doing this with any other kind of saw. Once the main straight cuts were made, I just finished off the cuts with a jigsaw. Hey. Well, hello. There's the innards. Looks like I did cut through a couple of the supports, but it's fine. They're not needed at this point. Everything's being held together by all this glued up board. After cleaning up the openings for the shelves, I got to work on the shelves themselves. For the drawer bottoms, I used some 1/4 inch white oak plywood that I got to match the exterior cladding, and I just improvised the shelf enclosure with some scrap plywood matching the size of the openings and the available space I had in the planter box for the depth. For some reason, these kinds of improvised contraptions are really fun to build, just like bringing together a bunch of mismatched Legos and building something useful. This is the shelving. It is simultaneously genius and jank. These front edges are just roughed in based on some very loose scribe that I did. When I made the decision to add these shelves, I also decided to add lights in there just so they would look a little nicer. So because they were going to be lit, I ended up painting the interior housing black just to hide those mismatched plywood pieces and give them an overall sleeker look. I tacked the housings into place with some brad nails, which should be plenty strong as I don't anticipate these to take too much abuse. I didn't get too crazy about aligning this board to the front of this edge because I knew I was going to have a piece of trim covering up this end grain anyway. And keeping in theme of this planter box, I'm going to have some, what is this? Walnut. Oh god. Oh shit, man. Looks ridiculously bad. Oh my god. Like this piece is ruined. This project really highlighted for me just how much time and effort goes into the little things. For instance, the bench frame took me about 3 hours to build and install, and that is close to 50% of the total mass of the built-in. And just these shelves alone added about 25 hours, and they were just an afterthought. Yes, I'm glad I added them, but if I were building this for a client, this kind of thing would really eat into my margins. Now that I'm full-time, I'm trying to figure out how I would handle this situation when it inevitably comes up. I would love to hear from the professionals on this one and how they handle these difficult and time-consuming changes. Would you pass these costs on to the customer, just take the hit, or just don't even offer these kinds of changes? Anyway, let me know. I'd love to hear. I guess this is the point where people say that played-out joke, you can never have too many clamps. And let that be the last time anyone says it. Once the shelves were all installed and trimmed out, I gave the planters their final cleanup. I went back through and cleaned up all the glue with an angled chisel, block planed down all the protruding trim, filled all the remaining cracks with that improvised filler, and then gave everything a thorough sanding, going through the grits at 120, then 180, and finally 220. Using pencil marks here really helps to track the areas that you've already sanded. After the sanding was done, I never thought this day would come, but construction was finally over for these planters. I started by vacuuming all the dust and then removing any residual dust with a tack cloth. And I'll just let this run for a bit. After what seemed like a lifetime later, I shifted my focus back to the bench part of this built-in. I mentioned I wanted a cushion on here and wanted it to be permanent, so I set out to make my own. After making a visit to Hobby Lobby, I picked up a couple 1-inch sheets of foam along with a couple yards of cushion fabric. I don't often make it to Hobby Lobby, but they are on a schedule of their own down there. Maybe it's because their main clientele are women over the age of 70 or the fact that they're criminally understaffed. But it felt like I was transported to a different dimension where everything is running at half speed and all sense of urgency had been sucked away from the earth. I barely escaped by the skin of my teeth, but now I had everything I needed for this cushion. I actually have never upholstered anything before, but I was formidably armed with a pneumatic stapler, so I knew I could probably figure something out with enough tension and trim.
Well, I think it'll hold. No, it should hold. This is what that profile looks like. I made this dado groove slightly deeper than the plywood to leave room for the staples and so on.
For the cover sheathing to hide this framework back here, I made these white oak board. I just think they look not so great. New plan is to just put a piece of plywood back here and paint it black. Cheaper to do that, but I think it'll also look better. You know what to do. I got the LED strips in. They look good, but there's a couple issues I'm starting to see. One is I'm a little worried about this strip making the turn around this facing downward. The strip will probably have to be slightly bent, and then you're gonna see those little bends here in the light. Option number 2 is that I actually have the light strips facing outward on this round section. I did put several hours into cutting out and putting this walnut edge banding on. As the sunk cost fallacy says, I shouldn't even worry about that and just move forward with what makes the most sense. From an aesthetic standpoint, I think the strips are going to look better on these. Running LED strips can be a challenging thing, especially when there are a lot of connections and tight areas to work around. The best advice I can offer here is to plan ahead. Make sure you have or make channels to run the wire so that it won't be seen, and try and do as much wiring in advance so you don't have to try and wire connections in really tight spaces. It gets better with practice, and I'll also say that the cheaper you go with the strips, the more often the strips and connections are going to fail. So one issue I'm seeing now, what's happening is this strip is first in line on the circuit. This is getting plenty of luminosity, but as it gets to the second strip, it's not getting enough power, it's not getting enough amperage. See how much dimmer this side is compared to this side. 2 ways to fix this. One is I got a new light strip that's 24 volt and it'll be able to run that kind of a span. And the second solution, which I'm going to do this one, is I'm going to have 2 different power supplies. So this one will have its own control and this one will have its own control. With all the lighting figured out and installed, I got to work on the planter tops. In order to get a matching look as the rest of the planter, I made the top out of 3/4 inch white oak plywood. I could have also glued up some boards to make a panel for the top pieces, but the plywood is just so much easier since it's already flat, sanded, and ready to use. The only caveat is that it has an MDF core, but that wasn't a huge deal since I had already been using walnut as an accent throughout, so this was just another spot for me to add more in the form of some edge banding. As far as cutting these out, I did the exact same technique as I did for the arcs for the frame. So I first cut out a template from some cheaper MDF material, then used a flush trim bit on the router table to shape the pieces perfectly after doing an initial rough cut with the jigsaw. This edge banding is about 1/8 of an inch wide, and it's just enough in terms of rigidity to make this arc without creating too many bad gaps. This arc is too small for 1/8 of an inch. It won't flex enough. I cut these, which are at 1/16 of an inch. 2 plies together. As they glue up, they'll shift and slide where they need to fit in this space. I attached the edge banding using pins and clamps, and then cleaned up all the edges with sanding, planing, and chiseling. And while I slave away at the planter tops, I'll talk about the costs associated with this build. Not including tools, incidentals like glue, screws, and other consumables, the main costs are here. The project overall costs close to $800 for the materials, lighting, and the other costs directly attributable to this build. Now personally, I think that's pretty reasonable considering how it came out, but of course, the real cost comes from the labor, and as I mentioned, I spent about 126 hours, give or take a few minutes, on this build start to finish. I am genuinely curious though. I would love to hear from you all, the viewers, on what you would pay for something like this, or at least what you think something like this would cost to have built for you by a professional contractor. Keep that in mind when you see the final shots and everything, and let me know because I'm planning on doing builds like this for others in the future, and would love to get a sense of what the market price for a custom build like this would be. Honestly, that would be extremely helpful to me. But back to the build here. If you noticed, I ended up adding some cup hinges since I wanted to be able to lift them up. And if you're curious on the finish, I'm using Rubio Monocoat and buffing it in with this Wen palm buffer. Alright, for the sill, I have an oversized piece here. I've got this tool. I figured you guys were sick of hearing my voice at this point. I know I am, so I took a quick break. But now I'm back, excited to narrate the enthralling third and final act of our bay window saga. So, I'll recap what happened while I was away. Well, first I wanted to have a completely uniform top surface across the bay window area, so to match the white oak of the planter tops, I decided to add new windowsills made of the same white oak plywood. Instead of replacing the existing sills, I'm just going to lay down the new sills on the old ones, which will work just fine in this case since the window frames were wide enough to still be showing with the new sills on. I also trimmed back the old sills to get a more seamless transition into the planter boxes, and finally added some spacer blocks to mount the hinges in place for the swinging tops. Alright, look at that. Woo. With the tops mounted, it was time to get into some essential finish carpentry, and that means trim. And I gave this area the full trim package. Stray cats back here, and I think there's like 3 of them. And that trim package comes with custom scribed walnut trim around the edges, more custom edge banding for the windowsills, and other coverings here with the goal to make everything look cohesive and hiding all imperfections and gaps. The planter boxes were a very snug fit, but for this bench to transition seamlessly into the planters, it definitely had to be. Yeah, look at that sexy transition right there. Look at that one too. That's nice. Alright. Got that one all trimmed out. Got this one all trimmed out. I just gotta do the big one here. As far as cutting out the windowsills, I use this measuring tool that basically form fits awkward surfaces and curves like these window drywall returns, and then I just transfer the shape of the form onto the workpiece and cut on the line.
It's actually perfect.
For this big one, since it's a lot more material, I just made sure it fit with a cheaper piece of OSB first, and then use that as my template for the white oak. Alright, now of course through the magic of editing, this looks like a piece of cake, but I can say without a shred of uncertainty that this was the hardest part of the project. This had all kinds of complications, from uneven walls, trying to work with the swinging hinges, height inconsistencies, but above all just figuring out a design so that all the top surfaces would have that built-in professional look. I mean, there were times when I didn't think I would ever finish, but eventually I persevered and finally got the sills looking respectable. While the glue dried for the walnut edge banding on the larger sill, I took the opportunity to install the black plywood to clad the framing just below the bench, and I had to take a moment to gush about how tight that fit was. Man, I'm still thinking about that. These sills were such a tight fit that I just used some construction adhesive to glue them down, and it would not take long to figure out that I really should have waited to glue this down. I added the final LED strip to the underside of the windowsill in a channel I cut out earlier. Next, I got to work on the backrest. I started by cutting out some angled supports out of plywood and then mounted them to the top of the bench with some pocket holes. I had exhausted my supply of white oak 3/4 inch plywood, so I made the backrest out of 1/4 inch plywood, which should still be adequate for this purpose. Well, so it turns out it's not so easy to get the backrest panel in place with the windowsill glued on, so after struggling mightily for about 30 minutes, I just ended up prying up the sill as far as I could and just jamming the backrest into place. Black one here for the trim around the window. Oh man, I was starting to get giddy at this point, seeing that this thing was starting to look like a bench and knowing that the finish line was close at hand. Last step here was to build the actual planters that would sit in the planters. I made these like a drawer basically, with the sides being 3/4 inch plywood and then a bottom panel made out of 1/4 inch plywood sitting in a 1/4 inch dado groove. I love the way uplighting looks on plants, so I decided to add some landscape lighting in the planters and made some cubbies for them to sit in. I would later find out that there would be some complications with this, but before I ran into any issues, I made sure to line the inside with plastic and then drilled out some holes for drainage. I picked up some house plants that I liked from the somewhat sad selection from my local Lowe's and proceeded to transfer the plants into their new home. If you don't have any plants, I would highly recommend. They're great. Why are they great? I don't know, but they're just really calming to have around, and it's like bringing a bit of nature into your house. Although I will say they're stupidly expensive. I think I paid like $120 for the 5 plants that I got, which is just plain highway robbery. Before we see my last hurdle to cross before the finish line, I just want to take a moment to thank you for watching the video up to this point. And I work crazy hard on these videos, and if you want to support me, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Those are absolutely huge for me trying to make a living at this, and as of posting this, I'm at 1,900 subs, really hoping I can push that number up to, dare I say, 2,000 subs with this one. Okay, with the business out of the way, the final roadblock I had to face was the landscape lighting. If you couldn't tell, when I went to put the planter top on, they were completely covered. Now I did want them to be partially covered so the lighting wouldn't be so harsh, but I got way too conservative here, and now I have to modify them while the plants and soil are already in there. Sorry, buddy. You're okay. After making those modifications to both planters, I was officially done with this project. Thanks again for watching and sticking with me during this build, and hopefully you got some tips, inspiration, or at a minimum some small amount of entertainment. And with that, I bid you adieu, and we'll see you on the next one.